This evening's talks are going to be, first of all, from a leading businessman who lives in the Leeds area. He's also a non-exec director for the Leeds Teaching Hospitals. He's also a fully chartered accountant. He's also several other things as well. He's got a CV longer than my arm, which is a pretty long arm. And he's going to talk to us for a little while about the general issues around why we should leave the EU, and then we'll have a Q&A at the end of that. And then we'll have a 5-minute break while everybody recharges their glasses, and then I'm going to talk for about 35-40 minutes about the specifics of the ground campaign and how we can best get as many votes as possible from people to vote to leave the EU. And that's going to be at a constituency level. So there's going to be a bit of procedural stuff in all that, but if you manage to stick it through all that, then we'll unwrap the food and we can all enjoy ourselves, talk amongst, and generally have a great evening. So to start off, I'm going to introduce this leading businessman from the area, which is Mr. Carl Chambers. Put your hands together, please.
I've never been described as a leading businessman either. Can I just first of all say about the campaign? I'll hold my hands up and say I'm from Vote Leave. I'm from Business for Britain, which is part of the Vote Leave campaign. But the reason I got in touch with Roger was to make it clear that from the business point of view, I know everybody's having trouble finding business people who are prepared to stand up and speak about leaving the EU. So I offered my services to Roger. I speak for Vote Leave as well. It's not something I'm naturally used to because I've never been involved in political campaigning before. It's only in the last few months really that I've got involved. And I thought what I'd do today is just say from a business point of view why I, as somebody who spent my life in business, think that leaving the EU is a good idea. And although I'm from a business background, I'll start off by saying it's not actually the economic reason that drives my thinking about leaving the EU. Because I think to put just an economic or a monetary aspect to leaving is actually to miss the big point. Because the big point, as far as I'm concerned, the fundamental point, is not how much it costs us or what we get out of the EU. It's actually a bigger question than that. It's who controls this country, the UK, and how do they control it? I'll start off by also saying I don't like governments, I don't like politicians. I'm a great believer in that old saying, if you got a government to run the Sahara, we'd run out of sand. But we do need governments, they are necessary. We need them to give us laws that enable us to have a safe, just, prosperous country. But the fundamental thing I believe is we grant powers to governments. They don't have powers, we give them those powers. We lend them those powers. And every 4 or 5 years we expect them to come back and hand those powers back to us and ask us to vote for them again if they've done a good job. And I believe that when that happens, if we grant those powers to people to pass laws over us, the way in which those laws are best passed is when they are close to us, when they're accountable to us. The closer they are, the more accountable to us they are, the more that power is wisely spent. And I think that's something which is generally pretty well accepted in the UK. We've got devolution to a greater or less extent in Scotland, Northern Ireland, Wales. In Manchester they're talking about devolution of spending powers inside the health economy, and they're talking about some way of doing that in terms of the Northern Powerhouse here. So to me it beggars belief that we've allowed a system to develop where something between 50 and 75% of the laws which govern our country rule the way in which our businesses carry out their activities and the way in which we carry out our activities, have been handed over to a group of institutions in another country. And I don't recall ever having been asked if they could pass those powers over. I'm not even actually sure that they have the ability to pass those powers over, but they have been. And I also look at it from the legal point of view. As Roger said, I'm a chartered accountant, but I started my life as a barrister many years ago. I was trained in the old traditions of the English legal system. 1300 years of training lawyers in the same place, and developing a concept of law which was incredibly valuable, very flexible, and probably the best legal system that I think the world has seen. A legal system that gave us the presumption of innocence until proven guilty, that gave us the idea of jury trial, that only your peers could convict you. a system that gave us the concept that you could only be detained by the government, by authority, for a short period of time before you were charged. And I contrast that with the legal system that we have in continental Europe, the system of Code Napoleon. Very much more prescriptive. It tells you what you're allowed to do, not what we have here, what you're not allowed to do. It has a system where you can be detained for long periods of time before charging. And it has a system where there is no clear distinction between the judiciary, the prosecuting authority, and indeed even the defence side of things. And that's a system which I think, unfortunately, is one we're seeing more and more in various ways imposed upon the UK because of the role of the European Court of Justice, which interprets UK law, which has supremacy over UK law and over UK courts, a fact which sadly many UK judges have now come to acknowledge. I mentioned we've given this power over to a group of institutions. You'll all be, I know I'm preaching to the converted here, but a group of institutions, the EU Parliament, the Commission, the Council. These are institutions which I think are largely unelected, largely unrepresentative, largely undemocratic, and largely unaccountable to us. And if I just look at each of those institutions in turn, let's look at the EU Parliament. In this country we have something like 13% of the population of the EU, but we have fewer than 10% of the MEPs in that Parliament. We have one MEP for every 900,000 people in this country. Luxembourg and Malta, they have one MEP for every 90,000 voters, 10 times what we do. On average, EU countries have twice as many MEPs per head of population as we do. And that's a parliament which has no power to initiate legislation. It's a toothless vehicle. We then look at the Commission, an unelected body, largely of failed politicians, or politicians we've never heard of. I'll mention Mandelson, Kinnock, Baroness Ashton. It's a home for the dead in many respects. And we used to have something like 15% of the votes in that commission. We now have fewer than 4%. You look at the council. The other thing about that, unelected commissioners, I'll say. Only one of them is elected, that's Juncker. The council, we used to have 17% of the votes in the council. We now have less than 8%. And with qualified majority voting, we've effectively lost our veto or any influence we had over key aspects of that policy. And our interests are being overridden all the time. Just to give you a couple of examples of that. Again, you might be very familiar with this, but if you look at the Parliament, on over 600 occasions now, I think it is, UK MEPs of all parties have opposed measures. They've come together to oppose something as being against our interests. 80% of the time, they failed to stop that law being passed. In the Council, I think it's now something like 72 times where we have opposed measures against the UK, against the UK's interests. 40 of those have been since Cameron came to power in 2010. We haven't won on a single one of those events. So our interests are being overridden every single day of the week. We've given powers to a group of institutions which are corporatist, what I call dirigistes. They like to direct things from the top. They are oligarchic. They like rule of a few people over the rest of us. And that sort of structure is open to lobbying. It's one of the features of this campaign, and one of the reasons why I decided I'd stand up and say something, that people think businesses are in favour of the EU. And it's true, a lot are. But one of the things which is striking is when you look at the businesses that support the Remain camp, they are almost always large, very large multinational corporations. And that's because they like lobbying one body, because regulations can work for very large organisations, because they can afford the lawyers and the accountants, guilty, to deal with those regulations. A small company can't. I'll give you a little example. There's a company in Huddersfield which has developed, as a spin-out from a university, a product which is a very, very potentially interesting product for use in hospitals. It's been approved in the UK, it's being sold in the UK, but the EU is now looking at a new directive to regulate that industry. It's going to require all the companies that operate there to re-qualify and retest all of their products. That's going to cost this company up to £100,000. It's a start-up company that only got into business about 2 or 3 years ago. If it has to pay £100,000, there's a real risk that it will go bust. The big companies love it. So it's open to lobbying. We see the American banks supporting it, and it's no surprise. And as I said, over all of this, we've got the European Court of Justice riding roughshod over UK law. So if we've given away all of these powers and all this control, my question then is what we get back worth it? Is the benefit that we get from being in the EU worth the loss of our sovereignty, if you could put a price on that? Well, unsurprisingly, I say no, it isn't. And I look at that in a very simple way. What does it cost us to be in it, and what do we get back out of it? And in simple terms, it costs us directly £350 million a week, every week, to be a member of the EU. From Yorkshire alone each year, we probably hand over 1.1 billion to the EU. That's 4 hospitals we could build. It's 12 times our highways budget. And if you drive around Yorkshire, you'll know how much we need that. It's about 24 times what we spend normally on flood defences. And again, Yorkshire ravaged by floods. Think what we could do with that. And that sum isn't a fixed sum. It could go up. You saw last year we had to pay another 1.7 billion because our economy is doing better than the EU economy. And that could happen again. The EU has made it clear that's unfinished business. Now people then say, yeah, but we get stuff back, we get the rebate. And we do, we get a rebate back. In fact, we don't hand it over, but it's still technically something we should be paying over. But again, that's something we've bargained away over the years, and bargained away, as far as I'm concerned, for very little in return. And again, that is something which is open to attack by the EU. It could be something that is reduced over the next few years, it could be eliminated. And then we get the subsidies, and we get agricultural subsidies, we get funds put back through the European Regional Development Funds. But nothing annoys me more than hearing people say, think of that EU money we get back. Because they don't have money. The only thing we get comes from us, from taxpayers, that hand over their money every single day of the week to the EU. And if you look at that, we have a system of regional development funds where they give money back to us, but they decide where it's spent, they decide how it's spent, and we have to match it pound for pound. In other parts of the EU, they might match it pound for £3, so we're getting a bum deal there anyway. The net result of all that, though, is that every year, or certainly this year, we're contributing the best part of £10 billion to the EU. We're the second largest contributor, we're one of a few contributors. We've contributed every year but one since we've been in the EU. And £10 billion a year is what we contribute. We subsidise the rest of the EU. We've then got a lot of indirect costs as well. People talk about regulations that businesses have to deal with in this country. And it's estimated that top 100 regulations that businesses have to deal with cost them about £33 billion a year. Now actually, for a businessman, I don't get too hung up on these regulations for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because some of them are good. Secondly, and this is a more important reason, quite a lot of those regulations actually don't come from the EU. They come from bodies like the World Trade Organization, the International Labour Organization, the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe. The thing is, though, that when those regulations are being discussed, the EU has a seat at that table discussing on our behalf and on behalf of the other 27 countries. And if our interests happen to clash with the other 27 countries, tough, we don't get a look in. If we left the EU, we'd actually have our seat back on those bodies. We'd be able to negotiate our own way and dictate those, or help dictate those regulations from the very top. But they are a real issue. They cost a lot of money. If you look at Yorkshire and the Humberside region, surveys show that 40% of small, medium-sized businesses think they hinder their business. Only 20% think they help. So the question then is, it costs us a lot to be in it. These regulations apply to 100% of companies in this country, whether or not they export to the EU, and only 5% of UK companies do export to the EU. So the question then is, do we get any real return out of this? You'll hear the argument time and time again that the real benefit for us of being in the EU is the trade that comes about, the increased trade. Back in 2011, Ed Davey, who was then a Minister for Business in the Department of Business, said that the EU countries trade twice as much with each other as a result of being in the single market as than they would if they hadn't been a single market. And that's the basis for a lot of the talk you hear about the EU benefiting households by about £3,000 a year. The fact is, though, there isn't a shred of evidence to back that up. There never was. House of Commons Library has said on 2 occasions there has never been a definitive study of the economic impact of our being in the EU. There's been a range of limited studies, and depending on which side of the fence they sat on, they showed either a cost of up to 6% of GDP or a benefit. But there's never been a really definitive study of the economic impact. So back earlier this year, I don't know if any of you might have read it, there was a report by Civitas, by Michael Burridge, who looked at the benefits to the UK of being in the EU in terms of its trade. They looked at 2 aspects. Firstly, do we get benefits from the trade agreements that the EU has entered into for us? And secondly, do we get benefits from increased trade with other EU countries? Frankly, the results that came out of that were alarming. We've had 42 years of the EU negotiating trade deals on our behalf. They've negotiated agreements with 55 countries whose gross domestic product, GDP, in 2014 totals $7.7 trillion. That sounds quite impressive. But they then compared what some small standalone independent countries had achieved over a similar time. Let's give you some figures. Well, bear in mind that figure, 7.7 trillion, that's the markets to which we gained access as a result of EU trade agreements. Korea entered into trade agreements with countries with gross domestic product of 41 trillion. Chile, 58 trillion. Singapore, 39 trillion. And Switzerland, 40 trillion. Now bear in mind, Korea, the largest of those, is an economy about half the size of ours. Yet these small countries, managed to get access to more markets than the EU did, up to 5 times. The other disturbing thing is actually after those agreements the EU did enter into have been signed, in 2/3 of cases UK exports to them actually decreased. So the next thing is then, did our trade with the EU increase? Well, actually yes it did. But if you look at the rate of growth to the 11 founding members of the single market, before the single market was created, we're actually trading 22% lower than you would have expected had those growth rates continued before we joined. So it hasn't achieved the benefits that we expected, nowhere near it. But what's even worse than that is that non-EU countries have managed to do better out of the EU exports than we have. Again, just to give you a few figures. This is between 1973 and 2012 in real terms. The UK grew its exports to the EU by 72%. The US by 114%, Canada by 115%, Australia by 190%, and India by 276%. So they're not in the EU, they don't even have trade agreements with the EU, but they're growing their exports more than we did. The fact is that we haven't, for whatever reason, been successful in exporting to the EU. If you look back in the 1990s, the share of our total exports going to the EU was about 55%. It's now below 45%. On current trends, it's been dropping every month for the last 18 months pretty much. Another 5 or 10 years it'll be 35% of our exports. So it's declining. And not only that, but the EU itself is declining. If you went back into the 1973, the EU represented 37% of the world's GDP. Now, after enlargement, it's 25%. It's a shrinking market. It's declining. It's arguably, in my view, the least successful of any trading bloc, and it's the only trading bloc that requires its members to have freedom of movement of people across its borders and moving towards a union of currencies. So we've got large costs, we've got very little to show for it. We're a member of a declining trade bloc, that's got some major financial and structural problems. And that's before we take into account the unquantified and possibly unquantifiable cost of being in the EU. The impact of mass immigration on our social infrastructure, our hospitals, our schools, our social services. The impact of the mass immigration on the lower paid workers in our own country. We saw the Bank of England say that every 10% increase in lower skilled immigration leads to a 2% drop in wages. And the loss of trade that we might have had if we'd been outside the EU, entering into the same sort of agreements as Korea, Chile, Singapore, Switzerland. And we've lost control. We've lost control of our government in many respects. We've lost control of our supremacy of law. I don't know how the hell we'd start to quantify that. And if we left the EU, the fact is, we would still trade with the EU. Across, from Iceland down to Turkey, almost every country, save one, is in some form of trading agreement. To argue that we would not be in a trading agreement with the EU if we left puts us in the same category as that one country, Belarus, a Stalinist dictatorship on the edge of Russia. I mean, frankly, I find that insulting when people talk about that. And to be blunt, even if we didn't get an agreement, what's the worst thing that would happen? The EU is bound by treaties, by its agreement with the World Trade Organization. It is bound to enter into arrangements of one sort or another to foster good trade, to foster trading relationships. It can't impose punitive sanctions or tariffs on the UK. And if you applied the tariffs that they would be bound to apply under World Trade Organization rules, it would basically come to a cost of about $5.5 billion at the most, against our 9.5, 10 billion of contribution. We'd still be 5 to 6 billion a year better off, and we wouldn't have the control over our legal system. We wouldn't have freedom of movement where we can't control our borders. We'd be able to pick and choose the regulations that suited us and that worked for those countries that exported to the EU. The final point that I always say when I'm talking about why I think we should leave the EU takes all that into account, but actually looks at what the EU might become. Because I understand that people don't like change, but I think it's a complete misconception to think that a vote to stay in the EU is a vote to stay the same. Because the one thing I think is certain in all of this is that the EU is not going to stay the same. Every country in the EU, apart from Denmark and Britain, are obliged to join the euro, or are members of the euro. The euro is in a disastrous state. I think Greece is about to default again. I think France and Italy are on the verge of default if their growth rates continue. The only way in which the EU can address that is by moving towards closer and closer union. Not just economic, not just financial, but also political. And the EU has never been about trade, frankly. It has always been a political project. EU politicians have always been open about that. Our own politicians haven't. Closer union is an inevitability. And with that closer union is a ratchet towards more lobbying, more centralisation of power. We will be a second-rate player in a third-rate organisation. We'll be consistently outvoted every time that the euro interest is threatened, and we'll be trapped in a declining, undemocratic, unelected body. Those are the reasons why I've decided I'm going to vote to leave, and I hope that you will do the same as well. And I thank you for your time.
Well, tremendous words from Carl with a lot of densely packed information, and I'm sure that people have either got questions to ask or points that they'd like to amplify with their own knowledge. So please, by all means, will somebody start the ball rolling and pop up a question to Carl or make a comment that he can then reply to. And if no one else does, I will.
That's the first summation I've heard from anybody, politician or not, about this situation, why we should come out of the EU, and I congratulate you on it immensely.
Excellent. Second.
It's actually hard to disagree with anything you've said, sir.
I know I'm preaching to the converted here, I know that.
I'll go further. I'll go further. Go should